I feel like usually when a show or movie has the phrase return to, there's an implication of it being a sequel, or even if it isn't, the characters are going back to a place they have a history with. Return to the Planet of the Apes is certainly not a sequel to anything, as it's in its own continuity, and while I guess technically you could say that the characters are returning to Earth after thousands of years, it wasn't the Planet of the Apes before, so that seems like a stretch. The most logical explanation then is that the return to the Planet of the Apes is that we, the audience, are returning to Planet of the Apes. But even that seems a little silly, since it had only been a year since the last Planet of the Apes thing, the live action show, and it's not even the same Planet of the Apes as before. It's more going to a different Planet of the Apes. None of this has anything to do with the content of the show, but that's weird, right?
What kind of people would carve apes' faces on a mountain?
For those of you that don't know, Return to the Planet of the Apes is an animated show that came out in 1975, and similar to the live action show that came out the year before, it was cancelled after only 13 episodes. It tells a story that, if you've been following along, should be pretty familiar to you by this point. 3 astronauts, Bill, also known as Blue Eyes by the Apes, Jeff, and Judy, land on a planet where apes are the dominant species and humans are pretty much just caveman, and the gang tries to figure out how to survive while helping the humans and sometimes other groups when they can. The plot is pretty much a combination of the original 1968 movie, Beneath the Planet of the Apes, and the live-action TV show, with some of its own original nonsense thrown in there for good measure. I would actually highly recommend it, especially if you like Planet of the Apes or silly animated shows from the 70s. However, before you go off and watch it, 1, you should go in blind, because half the fun of this show is the shock of how silly it gets, and 2, despite there being some good aspects to the show, don't expect it to be high quality. Okay, now you can go. Here's the thing. Despite my love for Return to the Planet of the Apes, on the surface it is not a good show. A lot of this comes from how cheap it is. The animation is pretty bad most of the time, often barely being considered animation, with it just being a still image being dragged over another still image, if it's not just a still image by itself. When there actually is animation, it's often just repeated, which can make the action scenes, if you can call them that, drag on as nothing much happens for a while. Sometimes the animation is bad to the point of comedy, like this shot of Judy that proves that even professionals have issues with drawing the second eye, or this scene where Jeff is talking and his head moves but his eyes stay perfectly still, which is rather disconcerting. But sometimes it's just weird, like the shot of an empty boat that just changes style in this same shot for seemingly no reason. The animation isn't the only thing that's a mess. The voice acting isn't much better, and while usually that means it's pretty emotionless, there's this scene.
You're crazy! Operate on my brain!
It spoke. The humanoid spoke.
I spoke because I can speak!
Which, when I first heard it, I thought someone had removed the actual audio and dubbed over it. But as far as I can tell, it's the actual voice acting. Now, this can all be excused, as it was very obviously made on the cheap, and usually it's still pretty watchable, and sometimes the animation is even good, and at least when it's really bad, it's pretty funny. And it's very obvious that the creators were working with what they had. What I won't excuse is what they've done to Zira. Zira and Cornelius are back from the original movies, married from the start this time, fulfilling much of the same role as they did in those movies as the ape scientists that are pro-human after they meet an intelligent human, this time being Bill Hudson. They even have the specific correct jobs, with Zira being a behavioral scientist and Cornelius being an archaeologist, though these jobs rarely come into play and the couple spends most of their time doing random chemical stuff in their lab, like doing something with
The specific gravity of the liquid.
and heating up random chemicals without paying attention to them. What I'm saying is they're pretty bad scientists, but as far as I can tell, they're the only ape scientists around, so I guess they have a lot on their plate. Zira and Cornelius have a very important role in the show, acting as the humans' allies on the inside, doing things like helping Bill when he's captured, providing information on what's going on with the apes, and even helping do some of the science with materials that the astronauts, living out in the wilds, wouldn't have access to. The problem is that the two don't have much to do 90% of the time, but they're still major side characters who I guess had to be in every episode, so they spend a lot of scenes just in their lab talking about how they're worried about the astronauts. Zira is done much worse by this than Cornelius. At least Cornelius sometimes has his own adventures. He goes to his archaeology site to show Bill and Jeff an underground river, and even goes on 2 adventures into the mountains with Bill. And both times, Zira is left with the rest of the gang to just kind of hang out and be worried, which is pretty much what she does the rest of the time too. I swear most of her lines are something along the lines of, "Oh Cornelius, I'm so worried about Blue Eyes." Now, this wouldn't be terrible. It wouldn't be good, but sometimes you have a lame character that doesn't do much, and sometimes you have to deal with that. And it's not like the other characters have much personality either, even though they actually do something. My biggest problem is that we've had a Zira before in the first 3 movies, and she was actually, a character there, and a really good one at that. She actually has personality, and she and Cornelius actually do things over the course of the series. Now, admittedly, that's 3 movies, so it's a bit easier for them to do things than a continuous TV show, but if you're not going to have a character do something, at least give her a personality and drive. The Zira of the movies was a no-nonsense scientist who stood up for what she believed in and argued with leadership about it. The Zira of Return can best be characterized by this scene.
Come now, Zira, dearest. That's no way for a behavioral scientist to act.
Right now, all I want to be is a female.
What an absolute downgrade of a character. From what I can tell, the only character trait she keeps from the original movie is being a little too obsessed with the talking human she found and hating gorillas, to the point where in this show, she and Cornelius refused to donate to the Gorilla Veterans Relief Fund, and seemed to be against it in a general sense, though it's possible they were just suspicious of the gorillas acting as the relief fundraisers, as they usually don't go door to door. Luckily, you don't have to deal with Zira being nothing that often, because they didn't know what to do with her, so she's just not on screen much. So if you can get past that and all the surface level issues, you'll find a show that actually does some really cool stuff. Part of that comes from the fact that this show is a combination of what came before, which means it can take those elements and sometimes make new things, and sometimes just take those elements and make them more consistent. Nowhere is this more noticeable than in the first episode, which takes the beginning of both the 1968 movie and Beneath the Planet of the Apes and just mushes them together. This mushing happens before the astronauts even land on the Planet of the Apes, as, just like in the original movie, the ship is moving so fast that the astronauts are going into the future. And then, just like what is assumed in the second movie, they go through a time warp. I'm not super fond of the space time warp excuse when they have the more scientific option in the show, but it certainly is a combination of both movies. The astronauts, after landing in a lagoon, much like they do in the 1968 movie, travel the desert in search of food, and again, just like in that movie, they encounter difficulties like falling rocks, quite frankly done a lot better in this show than in the movie, and lightning, I guess. But what makes it interesting is that Bill, Jeff, and Judy also encountered the things that Taylor and Nova encountered at the beginning of Beneath, like magic disappearing fire and earthquakes. Even innocuous things like this single plant in the desert proving there is life on this planet make an appearance. They even have one of the astronauts, this time Judy, disappear, just like Taylor did. Now, this all makes sense, as the show does have a cult a la the Nuke Worshippers in Beneath, so even if they only start to show up in episode 3, you might as well hint at them early. The mountains Taylor disappears into don't show up until episode 3, though they do show up, as Judy just disappears into the earthquake instead. And the similarities don't stop there. When Bill and Jeff finally escape the desert, they find humans, called humanoids in return, including Nova, just like in the original movie. These humans are a little more advanced, being more caveman than animal, but the general vibe is still the same. And, just like in Beneath, Nova has dog tags on her from an astronaut that landed there previously. Now we actually meet the owner of the dog tags in a later episode. This time, instead of Taylor, it's an astronaut from 2109, 134 years after Bill, Jeff, and Judy themselves launched. He's named Ron Brent, which makes Brent the only name shared between two astronauts in the entire franchise, the other Brent being, of course, from Beneath the Planet of the Apes, though their first names are different. Ron Brent is a bit of an amusing character. He crashed on the planet 15 to 20 years before our main characters and happened to be saved by the same humanoid clan our main characters met as they were migrating to the caves they started the show in. It was then that he met Nova as a child, teaching her to talk a tiny amount like Taylor tried to do in Beneath, and while he joined the group for a bit in their migration, he got lost in a sandstorm and just went back to his ship and pretty much stayed there, seemingly only leaving his base, which happens to be in the middle of the desert, to go fishing in a beautiful lush valley. I don't know why he didn't just move to the valley, but alright. Because he never left the area, he never learned that apes were the dominant species on the planet. Now, this is funny on its own, but it's even funnier to me, and I'm pretty sure only me, because based on the years given in the first and second movie, the Brent of Beneath the Planet of the Apes stayed by his ship for 23 years before leaving and learning apes were the dominant species. That's not what the movies were trying to say, they just messed up the dates, but that being what canonically happened to the Brent of Return is hilarious. There's also the case of how, despite presumably going through the same time warp, Ron Brent showed up before our main characters. Ron's explanation for this is,
I guess we made quite a bit of progress in rocket fuels and capsule design in those 150 years.
which even Jeff seems to think is a stupid reason. Brent seems to join the gang for the rest of the show, despite the fact that he suddenly isn't there for the last two episodes and no one comments on it, which isn't great. The similarities to the movies don't stop with the astronauts meeting the humanoids. There's also the astronauts' introduction to the apes, which has them getting hunted with a weird noise playing first to scare the humanoids, and our main character, this time Bill, getting captured. Nova doesn't get captured this time, but helps Jeff escape instead. Something that I think helps this show be a bit more palatable to Planet of the Apes fans is that it takes a bit of time to really deviate from the movies. The first episode is mostly things we've seen before, and the second episode starts that way too, with Cornelius and Zira being shocked at their new human study. Bill can do things like excel at the Hopkins manual dexterity test and show that to Dr. Zaius, who, of course, returns once again in this show. They also help the astronaut escape when they realize he can speak. After this, things start to deviate a little bit more, but we still get similarities from the original movies, mostly Beneath and the live-action show. One of the biggest similarities is our main antagonist for the show, Urko, taken from the live-action show, but who is also definitely a stand-in for Ursus from Beneath, to the point where he does a twist on the quote from Ursus, where Ursus says,
The only good human is a dead human.
Urko says,
The only good humanoids are caged ones. Or better yet, dead ones.
I think I like this Urko better than the live-action show, mostly because he actually faces consequences. Return has continuity between episodes, which means that when Urko continues to fail and also be a menace to the apes, he eventually gets suspended, something that can never happen in the live-action show because things rarely carried over. Now, quite frankly, I think a suspension is not enough, as he was suspended for stealing all the art in the city and blaming it on the Underdwellers, which is the name of the human cultists, and I think he should have been fully fired and arrested for that, especially since at this point he had been failing to capture the talking humans and kept threatening to take over ape society for a while now, but it's something. Urko is also involved in an episode that seems inspired by an episode from the live-action show Up Above the World So High, where a violent revolutionary wants to use flight to take over the government. In return, the episode is called Screaming Wings, and despite having modern vehicles, they haven't figured out flight. This time, it's Urko that wants to take over the government instead of a random new character, and instead of our heroes destroying what is this time a World War II plane, Judy just steals it and uses it later to stop the apes from attacking. It also doesn't have guns on it anymore and just a net, as this is a kid's show, I guess, so it's not going to have the characters bombing each other like Cassia planned to do in the live action show. The show also takes a lot of ideas from Beneath and splits them into different episodes. There's the episode where an ape saw something in the Forbidden Zone that convinces Urko and Zaius to go out to see what's going on and encounter illusions by the underground cultists, including a wall of fire. The context for the situations are very different, as in Beneath they go looking for the cultists, and in this show they go looking for the spaceship that Bill, Jeff, and Judy landed in, but it's still very clearly starting from the same area. The introduction to the cultists in an earlier episode is also similar, as just like Brent and Nova and Beneath, Bill and Jeff climb through a pipe to get to the ruins of New York City, which is how Bill and Jeff learn that the planet of the apes is Earth. Another episode introduces the idea of the cultists having a device that could destroy the world and our heroes needing to stop it doing that. Though this time it's a power device that's about to be engulfed in lava instead of a nuke that's about to be launched. Now, there's an argument to be made that borrowing so much from previous stuff is unoriginal, but it's a reboot. And I think one of the best things about a reboot like this is that you can take those elements from previous versions and do something different with them. Nowhere is this more obvious than with Zaius. Zaius is back to being Dr. Zaius instead of the Counselor Zaius he was in the live action show, and while he's still technically an antagonist, he's definitely the least antagonistic version we've had so far. Just like the Zaiuses of before, he's one of the few apes that know that humans were first and destroyed themselves, presumably in a similar way to what they did in the movies through war. Though all the information we're really given is that
Fires destroyed the Earth long ago.
What's interesting is that while this knowledge does partially inform Zaius wanting to kill all humanoids if any of them speak, that idea is also in the Ape Holy Book, called the Book of Simian Prophecy. They even reference a specific article, Article 18, when the Simian Senate agrees to let Urko try to wipe out the humanoids if he can prove that there are talking humanoids. Zaius may know the reason for that article, but that's about it. And after the second episode, he's not actively pursuing the humanoids as much as you might expect. Part of this may come from the fact that the only evidence of the talking humanoids the apes have is a guard that heard Bill talking to Zira and Cornelius when he was captured in episode 2, something the couple does not corroborate, and another gorilla that wandered into the Forbidden Zone and saw the trio of astronauts wandering around the desert, something you actually see in the first episode, but which doesn't come into play until episode 5, which is kind of fun. He's technically disproven because he said there was a ship that landed in the lagoon, and by the time the apes get there, there's no ship because Bill and Jeff had just blown it up. But even so, you'd expect Zaius to be a bit more antagonistic toward the humanoids in a general sense. And while he still is for attacking the humanoids and thinks that Bill not being captured could spell doom for ape kind, when Zira quite stupidly openly tells Zaius that she cares about Bill, he just openly says he's going to pretend he didn't hear that and tells them that involving themselves with the humanoids could lead to trouble and he wouldn't be able to get them out of it. A bout of willful ignorance that seems like a weird choice for someone genuinely worried about the destructive tendencies of humanity. I think this is partially due to Urko, who is, quite frankly, a way more obvious and immediate threat to apes. The actions of the humanoids and the astronauts are, throughout the entire show, pretty much completely defensive, and I could be wrong, but I don't think they even steal food like the humans of the original movie. They just exist in their caves and then eventually move to the valley even farther away. Urko, on the other hand, is openly trying to take over ape society, constantly threatening people and hatching secret plans to destroy the other two major groups on the planet, the underdwellers and the humanoids, often to the detriment of the apes. I'm shocked he hasn't been removed from power before the show starts, but considering he commands the loyalty of almost the entire army even after being pretty abusive to them and getting suspended, I suppose maybe the other leaders of Ape City are scared of him. And we know that at least Zaius is not just oblivious to the threat that Urko poses, because when the astronauts steal the World War II plane, Zaius assumes Zira and Cornelius were involved in the stealing, which of course they weren't, that would require them to do something, and he says it's an act of great loyalty to him because otherwise Urko would have taken over, and all of ape kind would have been under his dictatorship. So what we've got is an antagonist that, while he directs the attack of our heroes, he doesn't seem all that worried about them, to the point where he won't even investigate apes that are very clearly their allies, and is much more worried about the real antagonist of the show, Urko. What makes this even more interesting is that so far every variety of Zaius has had a big disagreement with the guerrilla general of his continuity, but they've all had different ways of dealing with it. The Zaius of Beneath the Planet of the Apes just let Ursus walk over him because he was scared of him. The Zaius of the live-action show would often stop Urko from doing something that would kill our heroes, but usually in a way where it makes him look incompetent, as they mostly had the same goal, just different approaches. The Zaius of Return, then, is of course a combination of the two. Someone that is scared of Urko, but still manages to stop him sometimes because he agrees with the basic idea of humans bad, while the Zaiuses agree with that, but not much else. So he's actually trying to stop Urko from doing damage instead of just being incompetent. The show's opinion of Zaius does seem to soften as the show goes on, but he's not the only antagonist to get that treatment. The Underdwellers have the same trajectory, and their antagonism is initially quite direct, which makes the softening a little weirder. Zaius, at least, is just worried about ape kind, so it makes sense that when a bigger threat to apes, Urko, shows up, Zaius doesn't worry about the humanoids as much. It adds a bit of depth to his character. The Underdwellers, on the other hand, kidnap Judy. Now, admittedly, the reason they kidnap her is really funny, and I think intentionally so. Because here's the thing, this show is pretty funny. It's not that it's always funny, but there's definitely a few things they do that are, at least some of which is intentional, though some, like the animation, may not be. I've already mentioned the fact that Ron Brent's situation seems like a parody of his counterpart in Beneath, but that's not the only date thing the show messes with. For reasons beyond me, the show decided that any date they specifically mention will be August 6th, which means that right before going through the time warp, the astronaut ship time is August 6th, 1976, and Earth's time is August 6th, 2081. After the time warp, they land on Earth on August 6th, 3979. Though the clock they're looking at doesn't actually give the first two digits of the year, so that seems to be a bit of an assumption. That would be weird enough, but Brent also launched on August 6, 2109. I don't know why they did this, maybe the time warp only works on August 6th, but it became like a trigger word for me, so when Zaius said
August body.
I had a bit of a moment. He's technically allowed to say that, he was using the words correctly. You can't do that when every date is August 6th. One of the simpler jokes is the time Bill and Jeff jump into a passing truck to sneak into the city to talk to Zira and Cornelius, and the truck driver is listening to the radio, with this playing.
I'm going humanoid over you. Homo sapiens go plumb bananas. Ever spring just watch them in the zoo. Apes would never, ever match their minds together. But when you're near, that's all I want to do.
The music in this show is legitimately good, but the fact that none of it, especially this, is available on Spotify is an affront to me specifically. Then there's the time Cornelius finds a blueprint for a hot air balloon. Well, technically Zira realizes that it's a blueprint, while Cornelius was just using it to protect a book, both of which he found in one of his very few archaeology digs. So I guess I can't say Zira didn't do anything in this show. Cornelius studies the blueprint for a while and realizes that it's missing something, a steering mechanism, because it's a hot air balloon, a thing which generally isn't steerable. Of course, Cornelius doesn't realize the way to steer it is to change altitude and hope for the best, and instead the ape couple asks Bill and Jeff to help, and the pair of astronauts somehow make a way to steer it. Now, this isn't really played as a joke, but it has to be, right? What I'm 90% certain is a joke is the reason the Underdwellers kidnapped Judy. See, the Underdwellers of Return don't worship a nuke like their counterparts in Beneath. Instead, the thing that rises out of the ground at their creepy cult services is a tree. They haven't been above ground since the end of the world, which I guess explains the tree, but they do have a prophecy that when Judy returns, she'll help them return to the surface world, and, as they're probably humans, take it back from the apes. We don't really get a full explanation for why they think this, except for a statue of her that was presumably made when she disappeared. The thing is, the Underdwellers don't call her Judy. Instead, they call her Usa, because for some reason, the statue of Judy doesn't have her name. It just says Lost and USA, and they thought USA was her name. Now that's good comedy. I know it doesn't sound it when I explain it, but I found it really funny watching it, alright? Despite Judy being the chosen one to these guys, they still kidnap her, and considering they then hypnotize her and never actually try to take the surface world from the apes, she doesn't seem to be following her prophecy very well. Bill and Jeff manage to snap her out of her hypnotism and try to escape with her, but she gets teleported back by their leader Krator's magic powers that aren't really explained. All of this puts the Underdwellers, a cult that kidnapped one person and imprisoned the other two, pretty firmly in the villain bucket, but over the course of the show, the gang goes back and helps the Underdwellers twice. The excuse both times is that these issues would cause problems for more than just the Underdwellers, but the first time Judy is still with them, and she doesn't seem that pressed about the fact that she might as well be a prisoner there, and it doesn't even seem like she's been hypnotized again. Part of the agreement for helping them is that Judy would be allowed to leave and join Bill and Jeff, but she still agrees to come back when the time comes for the Underdwellers to attack, which seems insane. Though considering they could just teleport her back to them, she doesn't really have much of a choice. Even still, the second time they help the Underdwellers, our heroes don't seem nearly as harsh on them as they should be. Speaking of the second time the astronauts helped the Underdwellers, the general world building of this show is nonsense. The plot of that episode, called Invasion of the Underdwellers, has Urko and the rest of the army steal every piece of art in Ape City and blame it on the Underdwellers. His claim is both extremely well thought out, with no evidence. A reporter asked the museum director if he thinks the thief was the Underdwellers, and he says it could have been, and so the newspaper prints that it was definitely on the Underdwellers. So with almost no evidence, the city immediately thinks it was the Underdwellers. And really stupid. Urko's plan was to kill all the Underdwellers and then just return the art, like that wouldn't get him in trouble. The thing is, the art they steal is, well, Azira and Cornelius have a first edition book of the collected works of William Ape Spear. We see some of the paintings the army steals, and it's just famous art that we know with ape faces covering the human ones, including the Mona Lisa, which I like to call the Monape Lisa. Actually, they specifically mentioned that one. What do they call it?
The Ape Lisa.
Alright, never mind. This show is terrible. They went with Ape Lisa when Monape Lisa was right there and clearly the better option. 0 out of 10. What's even the point? The thing is, slapping the word ape in front of a bunch of names and things is really funny, even though from the perspective of the apes, it doesn't exactly make sense. And this isn't the only thing that's like that. They also have the Simian Senate instead of just the Senate, and the newspaper calls the planet of the apes. It's just all like that. And in a show that is taking itself a little more seriously, maybe I would have issue with it, but here, it doesn't really matter. Something I find a little more interesting and does have actual implications is another piece of world building the episode brings up, and that's the Book of Simian Prophecy. In Invasion of the Underdwellers, it's revealed that the book has at least a physical description of the Underdwellers, and based on Urko knowing that these mountains coming out of the ground are the works of the Underdwellers, we can assume that the book also explains what they do at least a little bit. This makes the relationship between the apes and the Underdwellers pretty interesting. The Underdwellers are humans, kind of, and they're actually the ones that plan to eventually attack the apes and take over the surface world. In a way, they represent the humans that Zaius is so scared of way more than the humanoids do. But the idea of attacking the Underdwellers is never even considered except during this episode. Now, we don't know how much the apes know about the Underdwellers, so maybe they don't realize they're planning to eventually attack, but that seems unlikely, considering we know that somehow Urko knows where to send a boatload of explosives to destroy their entire society. I think it's more a case of mutually assured destruction. The humanoids are weak and pathetic, so destroying them before they get to the point where they're actually a threat makes sense in some twisted way. A war between the apes and the Underdwellers, on the other hand, would probably cause a huge amount of damage on both sides, and no one really wants that, at least not for now. Unfortunately, the show was cancelled before we ever found out how the Ape Underdweller War would go, though there's a chance they would never have bothered doing that anyway, but Return to the Planet of the Apes did manage to have some kind of finale despite that. But in order to talk about the finale, there's two things I haven't mentioned yet that are important to understand. The first is another piece of world building that just seems like the creators having fun, and that's the creatures. I guess whatever caused the apes to be intelligent did a lot more than that, because despite this show taking place on Earth, we don't see a single animal that is currently here on Earth. There's animals that are pretty close, like the bison with unicorn horns or the giant spider in the sewers, but sometimes there's just a random thing like a lagoon creature. One of the most mysterious of these is a flying thing the characters call a giant prehistoric bird, but what I'm gonna call a dragon. What's weird about this thing is that it just suddenly shows up to cause problems out of nowhere. The other animals are pretty stationary in where they live, which makes them a bit more believable. The spider could have been in the sewers for a long while, but as long as it stays there, it's not really something that anyone has to deal with unless you go into the sewers. The dragon, on the other hand, just suddenly shows up above Ape City with no explanation. There's this amazing interaction between Zira and Cornelius.
I can only presume it's some kind of monster.
Monster? What kind?
One we've never encountered before.
And while it's the least helpful conversation two people could possibly have, it does tell us that this thing is not normally around. When the humans see it attacking the unicorn bison, they have multiple conversations being confused about why it's here and where it came from, which makes it sound like they were setting something up, but we never got there. They managed to defeat it by hitting one of its wings with a plane wheel, but that's not the last we see of it. The other thing to understand is that the book Cornelius found and wrapped in the hot air balloon blueprints is a children's book called A Day at the Zoo that, of course, has a picture of humans looking at an ape in a cage. So, for Zira and Cornelius, this is proof that humans were first. They think that revealing it at that time is a bad idea since Urko is looking for evidence that humanoids are too dangerous to exist, and technically the book would be evidence of that. So, Cornelius and Bill go on an adventure in the newly made hot air balloon to hide the book and end up crashing into a mountain range, where they meet a group of mountain apes that worship a giant ice statue of an ape they call Kygor.
Ice ape cometh.
I beg your pardon?
I beg yours.
I'm sorry, did I say ice statue? I meant a giant ape encased in ice. Turns out King Kong over here, actually, hang on. Interesting. It turns out Kygor's resting state is just being encased in ice as he breaks out of the ice this time to save Bill and Cornelius from the gorilla army, but the next time we see him, he's encased in ice again, only to break out again. I love Kygor. He's my favorite character in the show, though admittedly he doesn't have any meaningful competition, simply because it's so ridiculous that he's just there. But of course you would have a giant ape in a show like this. It only makes sense. The High Llama that leads the mountain apes says,
Kygor has been real since the beginning of legends.
which to me implies that the ape has been around since potentially before the end of the world. They do worship him. Maybe he is simply a god. Why not? I think the fact that Kygor isn't in any of the other Planet of the Apes media is incredibly disappointing. Bring him into the new continuity. I don't care that it's supposed to be a more grounded version. You could make it work. The virus made some apes smart, but it made one really big. I don't know. The finale to Return to the Planet of the Apes has our heroes decide that since Urko has been suspended, now would be a decent time to get the book and reveal it to Zeus in the hope for peace between humanoids and apes. So Bill and Cornelius go back to the mountain apes and Kygor to collect the book, while Jeff, Judy, and Zira, Ron has simply disappeared at this point, try to protect the humanoids from the acting ape general, who is extremely incompetent and not much of a threat. The problem Bill and Cornelius run into is that the dragon, woken up by a rock falling into the water, decides to attack them. And of course, Kygor saves the day. It's not exactly the most exciting action scene, but Kygor does grab the dragon, swing him around, and throw him into the snow, which is pretty good. And I guess that's all you could ask for given the circumstances. For what it is, it's a pretty decent finale. However, it's not a full conclusion. Due to this show actually setting things up episodes before they happen, the show does have some loose ends. The dragon, defeated once again, is still alive and is still a mystery creature from nowhere. There's also the suspicious Veterans Relief Fund apes, though it's possible they were just scoping out everyone's home so the army could steal everyone's art. But I think the biggest loose end is the fact that Cornelius' plan to show the book to Zaius will most likely fail just by the fact that Zaius already knows humans were first, and that's actually the problem. Zaius has softened since the beginning of the show, but if that's mostly because Urko was a more pressing threat, then with him suspended, showing this book to Zaius could well reinvigorate his fears of the humanoids, and that complete failure of a plan could have been really interesting to see if the show had continued. What I'm saying is this show's continuity is the only one we've seen so far that needs to be continued, and the fact that it didn't get extra stories, but everything else put to screen, including the live action show did, is terrible. Also bring back Kygor.